All right. So first of all, good evening, folks. And just as a reminder, I sent out an email this morning and I said I was going to do something that I said I wouldn't do, which is skip. What I don't want to do is just like cherry pick things, but we had been discussing for some time the question of the authenticity of various statements attributed to various rabbis of previous generations, and it got bogged down. So I want to skip just a little bit to get us back. I mean, we're still not even back into the main subject. I mean, we are still the Gemara is still in theory discussing the question of the prohibition of eating from near Mincha time on Erev Pesach. We're still discussing that, even though we haven't been discussing that at all for quite some time. Okay, so 102A, paragraph 8. The Gemara returns to the subject of interrupting one's meal to recite Kiddush, right? Remember, we had discussed this a few weeks ago, right? What happens if you are eating essentially a late Friday lunch and lunch goes a little bit long and you look out the window and you notice that it's become dark and Shabbat has started? What do? Right? And the two main disputants in this are Rabbi Yehuda, who says you have to stop your meal and do whatever, which is not exactly clear just from the Baraita. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, you don't. You go ahead and finish your meal. Okay. So the sages taught, with regard to members of a group who were reclining and eating a meal and the day of Shabbat was sanctified, they bring one of the diners a cup of wine and he recites over it the sanctification of the day. Okay. The Hebrew phrase here is Kedushat Hayom. Okay. The sanctification of the day. In our parlance, we call that Kiddush. Right. But what does the word Kiddush really mean? I mean, aside from, bagels and tuna salad, right? Kiddush means sanctification, right? It's from the same root as kadosh or kaddish or kedusha. So they're sanctifying, but what are they sanctifying? They're sanctifying the day, right? I mean, in the Amida also, is on Shabbat or holidays, right? We have the third blessing of the Amida, right? How does it end? Baruch atah Adonai mikadesh haShabbat, right? Or on holidays, Baruch atah Adonai mikadesh Yisrael v'hazmani. Blessed are you who sanctifies the Sabbath, or blessed are you who sanctifies Israel and the holidays. Okay, so that's called Kiddush, Kiddushat Hayom, the sanctification of the day. So, all right, so you're eating and Shabbat has started, you're mid-meal, you're still eating, Shabbat has started. They bring one of the diners a cup of wine and he says Kiddush, right? And then they bring a second cup over which he recites grace after meals. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi says one may continue eating the rest of his meal even until dark. Now, I want to throw out a question here. A second cup over which he recites grace after meals, Birkat Hamazon. What does that mean? What does that mean? Is anybody familiar with that practice? You say Birkat Hamazon over a cup of wine.
I am.
You are. Who is that? Barnaby. Okay. So say more, but unmute yourself. Unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Sorry. Oh, I was muted? Okay.
Yes.
Huh.
Well, you weren't muted. I mean, because you said I am and I couldn't see you. So your camera was off, but your microphone was on, and then you turned your camera on and your microphone went off. Whatever, it's fine.
Interesting. Okay. So on Birkat Hamazon, you were saying wine over Birkat Hamazon is kind of a bygone practice. It's usually done in two contexts, one of which is less familiar, one of which is more familiar. The less familiar context is when on Seudah Shlishit, the afternoon Shabbat meal, you say Birkat Hamazon over a cup that you make for Havdalah.
Right.
And the other one, which I hope where everyone's familiar with, is one of the four cups during the Pesach Seder, the third of which is actually the blessing over, is the cup over Birkat Hamazon.
Right. So exactly. During the Passover Seder, the third cup, we say Birkat Hamazon over the cup. Okay. And it is a practice that has mostly fallen out of use. I think observant German Jews still have a tendency to do it. I've seen it in homes of some German Jews. Some Hasidim still do it. But there's another context in which you might be familiar. If you've ever, and I don't assume that you have or have not, but if you've ever attended a Catholic Mass, okay, and I had an aha moment once, okay? So as part of the ritual of the Mass, all right, the priest says, when supper was ended, he took the cup. Again, he gave you thanks and praise. Okay, and I said, aha! Birkat Hamazon over a cup of wine, right? When supper was ended, he took the cup. Again, he gave you thanks and praise, right? So there is a remnant of this Mishnaic Jewish practice in the Catholic Mass, okay? Which makes perfect sense because Jesus lived at the time, roughly around the time of the sages of the Mishnah. So it's no accident that Jesus's practices coincided with the practices of the rabbis of the Mishnah. Okay, so at any rate, Rabbi Yehuda says we bring two cups, one for Kiddush and one for Birkat Hamazon. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you continue eating the rest of the meal even until after dark. Okay, and now, of course, Rabbi Yossi doesn't say, and we just ignore Shabbat altogether, right? He says, right, Rabbi Yossi says, once they have finished your meal, right? In other words, you finish your meal, and then you do that. You bring out two cups. Over the first cup, one recites the grace after meals, and over the second cup, he recites the sanctification of the day. All right, so Rabbi Yossi also says two cups, but Rabbi Yossi says first cup for Birkat Hamazon and second cup for Kiddush, right? Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. First cup for Kiddush, second cup for Birkat Hamazon. Now, what is the logic? It doesn't say this specifically, but what's the logic of Rabbi Yossi's position?
He's saying that thanking God after you should thank God immediately, I guess, after you eat. Is that what his thought is?
It could be. I mean, that's not the way I read it. I mean, the way I read it is that he wants to make a much more clear-cut distinction, right? In other words, right, that one of the primary issues that comes up is, right, I ate my meal, it was a weekday. I'm saying Birkat Hamazon, it's Shabbos, right? The Birkat Hamazon for weekdays and the Birkat Hamazon for Shabbos are different, right? So do I say the weekday Birkat Hamazon, right? Which, I mean, the logic behind that was, if I'm saying the prayer for a meal that I ate on the weekday, I say the weekday prayer, right? But the other logic is, no, you're saying the prayer on Shabbos, so say the Shabbos prayer, right? But clearly, now if you said Kiddush, then you've started Shabbos, right? So for sure, if you've said Kiddush and then you're going to say Birkat Hamazon after Kiddush, for sure you're going to say the Shabbos Birkat Hamazon, right? But here, in other words, I think what Rabbi Yosef is saying is like finish one thing and then start another, right? I mean, I will tell you that I say this to Kelly all the time, okay? Let me finish this thing before you ask me about the next, right? I one thing at a time. I don't multitask, and I can't think about Y when I'm still doing X, okay? And I think Rabbi Yosef is like me. So Rabbi Yosef, no. All right, say Birkat Hamazon, right, for the meal that you just ate, and then say Kiddush, right? Now the Gemara asks the question, why do they need 2 cups? Let them say both of them, grace after meals and Kiddush over 1 cup, right? I mean, what's the problem, right? If granted that you need a cup, why do you need 2? Why do you need 2? All right, so the next paragraph answers that question. Okay. Rav Huna said that Rav Sheshet said, one does not recite 2 sanctifications, right? In other words, the Havdah Kiddush is a sanctification, and Birkat Hamazon is a sanctification, right? I mean, because you're sanctifying God for having provided the food. So they're 2 separate things, but they're both sanctifications. You don't do it over 1 cup. What is the reason? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzhak says because one does not perform mitzvot in bundles. All right, what does that mean? If someone performs multiple mitzvot all in one go, he gives the impression that they are a burdensome obligation that he wants to complete as fast as possible, right? Let's just get it over with, right? Now, look, the fact of the matter is sometimes that's the case, right? I mean, that is to a certain extent an alien attitude to most American Jews, right? Because most American Jews feel, if I feel like doing it, I'll do it. And if I don't feel like doing it, I won't do it, right? But that's not halakha. Halakha doesn't say, do these things if you feel like them, It says, do these things. Right? Now, optimally, one should do them with enthusiasm. Right? But if you can't muster the enthusiasm, do them anyway. Right? But if you can't, but don't create the impression that you're doing it grudging, right? Don't create the impression that it's burdensome and you just want to be done with it as soon as you can. Okay, so that's why you need two separate cups so that you're not creating the impression that you're just doing it because you have to, but it's burdensome and you just as soon not. Okay. And then they say, wait, velo? Right? Is that really so? And does one not perform multiple mitzvot together? But wasn't it taught in a Baraita? One who enters his home at the conclusion of Shabbat recites the blessing over the wine, and then over the light, and then over the spices, and thereafter he recites Havdalah over the cup of wine. Okay, I realize that A, this is all in English, and B, it needs unpacking. But if you think about it, this is exactly what we do, right? I mean, forget about coming home at the conclusion of Shabbat, right? I mean, because, you know, if you're coming to Havdalah, it's on Zoom anyway, right? But when we say Havdalah, right, what do we say? Borei Pri Hagafen. Right now, this is slightly different order, right? We say Borei Pri Hagafen, and here it says then Borei Me'orei Ha'esh. Well, we actually do, and then Borei Minei V'Samim, we actually do them the opposite, right? We say the spices and then the light, and then he recites Havdalah over the cup of wine, which we do, right? Baruch atah Adonai, Mavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, and only then do we drink the wine, right? Because why? Because we're saying Havdalah over a cup of wine. If we weren't saying, because if you think about it, it's unusual, right? Normally, I mean, think about it. I mean, these are things that like we just do, and therefore it doesn't seem unusual. But if you think about it, it should seem unusual, right? Because it's the same thing with Kiddush, right? We say Borei Pri Hagafen, and then we say Mikadesh Shabbat, right? And normally you say a blessing and then you do the action, right? You say Hamotzi, you eat the bread, right? You say Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat, you light the candles, right? You say Al Mitilat Yadayim, you wash your hands, right? You say Borei Pri Hagafen, you drink the wine, except we say Borei Pri Hagafen and we don't right away drink the wine because we're saying Kiddush over a cup, or we're saying Havdalah over a cup, right? So that's what we do. And if he has only one cup of wine, he leaves it for after he eats his food and uses it for grace after meals and arranges all of the other blessings together thereafter. Okay, so the Baraita says that you could use the same cup for Birkat Hamazon and Havdalah. The Gemara answers, we cannot prove anything from here. Is the case where one does not have an additional cup is different. One who has two cups of wine is required to recite grace after meals over one of the cups and Havdalah over the other. In other words, right, so the Gemara recognizes scarcity, right? I mean, if you only have one cup of wine, then obviously, right, you're going to say Birkat Hamazon, right? Now, so this is a question. So, I mean, this is no longer the person who enters his home at the conclusion, of Shabbat, right? Because this is a person who's already home at the end of Shabbat and he's eating, let's say, as Barnaby said, Sudah Shlishit, right? The third meal of Shabbat, which is late afternoon, right before Shabbat ends, right? So he says Sudah Shlishit, and then he says Birkat Hamazon, and then Shabbat is over, and he says Havdalah, right? But he only has 1 cup of wine, so he uses it for both, right? But if you have 2 cups of wine, then you should use 2 different cups, right? So, but this is a case where we are doing mitzvot in bundles, right? I mean, now this question of a person who comes home after Shabbat and says Havdalah, this reminded me actually of a story that my dad told me once. I don't think I've told this. I don't think any of you have heard this story that my dad told me. But my dad's mom died when my dad was 16. Okay, and she died at home on Shabbat in the afternoon, late afternoon. So my dad was sent to tell his grandfather, who lived with them, that his daughter, right, my dad's mother was his grandfather's daughter, was sent to shul to tell him that she had just died. Okay, and my dad encountered his grandfather walking home from shul. So my dad tells him, Mom just died. And his grandfather turns around and heads back to the shul. And my dad says, what are you doing? And my great grandfather says to my dad, I'm not sure now if I'm allowed to say Havdalah or not. So I'm going to ask the rabbi if I'm allowed to say Havdalah. Now, does anyone understand what's going on here? Right? What's going on here? Why would he? Yeah, Gail.
So is it sort of like when you know someone's passed away and you no longer have the obligation to do minyan?
Exactly. Right. That's called aninut. Right. That state of being is aninut, and the person is an onen. Right. And an onen is exempt from all the, but not only exempt, but prohibited. Right. Like if you're not allowed to put on tefillin, you're not even allowed to say hamotzi. You could still, you still have to observe all the prohibitions, right? You can't say, oh, before I kept kosher, I loved lobster. So now that my dad has died, I'll go out and get a lobster, right? That you can't do, right? But between the time that somebody that you have to sit shiva for dies and their burial, you are in this state of like suspended animation, right? So, like, my great grandfather would come home from shul and he would say Havdalah at home. And he wasn't sure whether now he could do it. And the answer is, by the way, that you can't. Okay, now what's interesting is that I knew this story for years and years. And then my dad also died on Shabbat, and I didn't do Havdalah that night. But it kind of reminded me, one who enters his home, because that's exactly what my great grandfather would do. He would enter his home at the conclusion of Shabbat and say Havdalah. Okay. Go on. The Gemara continues its line of questioning, but there is the case of a festival that occurs after Shabbat when presumably one has enough wine, right? I mean, why do we presume that? Because you know, right? Because you need wine for Shabbat and you need wine for Yom Tov, right? So I mean, I guess the assumption of he doesn't have enough wine is not he's poor and he couldn't afford it, right? It's he didn't arrange to have the wine because he didn't know that he might need it, right? And by the way, this is not necessarily a crazy assumption, all right? Now, one of the things that you'll notice, and if we ever get further into this chapter, you'll see that the Mishnah is going to say, for this ritual, you need wine. Okay, and then the Gemara is going to come along and say, doesn't necessarily have to be wine. Okay, it could be beer. It could be some other alcoholic beverage. Okay, now, why is the Mishnah insisting wine? But the Gemara says, it doesn't have to be wine, could be beer, could be some other alcoholic beverage instead of wine. Why? Gail, you unmuted, so I assume that means you want
Yeah,
to say
well, I mean, I would have thought that, I mean, the Talmud was written like in Babylon, and it wouldn't depend upon where you were at the time. Because, you know, you've talked before about the fact that in Iran or Iraq, they didn't drink wine, they drank beer because of where they were.
Exactly, right? I mean, Eretz Yisrael is a Mediterranean climate, right? It's not exactly, a rainy climate, but it is a climate where there is sufficient rain to grow grapes, right? Iraq, Iran, desert, right? They're not growing a lot of grapes in Iran or Iraq. I mean, they're not today because obviously, they'd cut your head off if you were trying to produce wine. But even in ancient times, right? It was not a wine producing area, and wine is therefore scarce and expensive, right? Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, wine is relatively abundant and relatively cheap. Okay, so but even so, if you know that Yom Tov is coming, right? So you're going to make sure that you have wine because you have Kiddush twice on Shabbos, right? And then Kiddush twice for each day of Yom Tov, right? And if you're in Babylonia, it's 2 days of Yom Tov, right? So that's 4 more Kiddushes that you have. So you're going to have wine on hand. Okay. Nevertheless, Rav said that the proper order of the blessings is according to the Hebrew acronym Yud, Kuf, Nun, Hey. Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, Havdalah. Right? Yayin, Kiddush, so Borei Priagafen, Mekadesh Yisrael Vahazmanim, Ner Borei Me'orei Ha'esh, Havdalah Hamavdia Ben Kodesh L'chol. Right? That's what Rav says. And they say in answer to this question, from the fact that Rav did not say that one recites the blessing for time, Shehechianu. This proves that we are dealing with the seventh day of Pesach, which is the only festival day on which one does not recite the blessing for time. If so, it is possible that whatever wine this person had, he has already consumed over the course of the festival and does not have enough wine left for two separate cups. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit, right? Zman, you don't say Shehechianu, proves that we're dealing with the seventh day of Pesach. Why? Because the seventh day of Pesach, or really the seventh and eighth day of Pesach, are the only days that we don't say Shehechianu as part of Kiddush, right? Why don't we say Shehechianu as part of Kiddush on the seventh or eighth day of Pesach? All right, when do we say Shehechi? Barnaby?
We don't say Shechianu on the seventh day of Pesach because it's still Pesach. It's still the same korban, the same sacrifice that is. So we don't say full Hallel. So it's not like, with Shmi Atzeret, which is a holiday upon itself. Pesach, the seventh day of Pesach is still Pesach.
Right, seventh day of Pesach is still Pesach, right? It's not a different holiday than the first day of Pesach, right? Whereas Shmini Atzeret is a different holiday than Sukkot. Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret are separate holidays, right? Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret are separate holidays, right? And then there's Shavuot, which again, biblically is only one day, right? So we say Shehechianu at the beginning of a holiday, but the seventh and eighth day of Pesach are the end of the same holiday. Okay, so if Rav is not including in his formula, right, because he's saying Yud Kuf Nun Hey. Yain Kiddush, right. Yud Kuf Nun Hey, not Yud Kuf Nun Hey Zion, right? Zman. So we're talking about Pesach, and therefore he might really not have wine, because why? He had it over the festival. He had it for Kiddush, he had it for Seder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's not especially in Babylonia. It's not unreasonable to consider the possibility that you actually ran out of wine. Okay. But the first festival night that occurs after Shabbat, when one has wine, and nevertheless, Abayi said, Yud Kuf Zayin Nun Hey. Yain Kiddush Zman Ner Havdalah. Rava said, Yud Kuf Nun Hey Zayin. All right, not going to get bogged down in the different orders of what you say, because the point is they agree that one recites multiple blessings over a single cup of wine, right? But the Gemara rejects the previous explanation in favor of the Havdalah and Kiddush are one matter, as they both mark and draw attention to the sanctity of certain days. By contrast, grace after meals and Kiddush are two entirely different matters. Okay? Right? In other words, why do we say, right? Havdalah and Kiddush we say for the same reason, right? To mark and distinguish time, right? Whereas Birkat Hamazon, why do we say Birkat Hamazon? It's not to mark and distinguish time. It's to give gratitude for our food, right? So you could say that Havdalah and Kiddush are intrinsically related, right? They're one thing because they both have the same purpose, to mark and distinguish times, whereas Birkat Hamazon and Kiddush are two entirely different matters. So therefore, if you say Birkat Hamazon and Kiddush over one cup, you're combining two unrelated mitzvot over one cup, and this appears as if you're doing it to get it over with as quickly as possible, and therefore you're not allowed to do this. Okay. Now we're going to get back to the matter itself. Rav said, Yain Kiddush Ner Havdalah, and Shmuel said, Yain Ner Havdalah Kiddush. Okay. And Rabbah said, we got all these different we can skip this paragraph. It's just, you know, different suggestions as to what order you say what. So we can skip that. So the father of Shmuel, Abba ben Abba, sent the letter to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Yehuda Hanasi is the guy who codified the Mishnah, right? So this is around 200 of the Common Era. Teach us, her Rabbi, how should one recite the order of Havdalah when a festival occurs after Shabbat? Rabbi, that is Yehuda Hanasi, sent him the following response. This is what Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, said, who said it in the name of his father, who said it in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanan. The proper order of the blessings is Nun, He, Yud, Kuf. Ner, Havdalah, wine, and Kiddush. Now, in fact, this is not how we do it. Okay, if you have a Haggadah, I actually should have brought a Haggadah, but because when would this occur? This would occur when the first Seder is on Saturday night, right? Which is not that infrequent, right? The first Seder is on Saturday night, right? So as part of the Kiddush sort of ritual, you say Havdalah, right? And the acronym we actually do is Yaknahaz. Yain, so we say Brei Pri Agafen, we say Kiddush, right? Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, Ner, Borei Me'orei Ha'esh, Havdalah, Hamavdil ben Kodesh LeKodesh, actually, and Zman, Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, right? And I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but if you have an Ashkenazi Haggadah, when it gets to this, very, very often there's a picture of a rabbit for this Havdalah ritual. Has anybody seen this or heard of this? No. Okay, and the reason is that the abbreviation for the order in which we do it is Yaknehaz, which sounds like, and I don't really know Yiddish, but Yag Den Has, which means hunt the rabbit. Okay, hunt the rabbit. Yag, right? Jägermeister actually is hunt master, right? So Yag den Has, hunt the rabbit, Yakna Has, right? So it's easy to remember. That's the only way that I remember it, in fact, was learning about the picture of the rabbit and that the abbreviation. Now, there's no connection because I can tell you in 5th century Babylonia, nobody was speaking Yiddish, right? But it just fortuitously, the abbreviation works out to an approximation of the Yiddish phrase for hunt the rabbit. Okay. So, paragraph 3. Amar Rabbi Hanina, Mashal de Rabbi, Rabbi Hanina said the following parable serves to explain the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania. This is comparable to a king who is exiting a city and a governor is entering. You first escort the king out, and afterwards they go out to greet the governor. Okay. Who's the king and who's the governor in this? I mean, normally, right, when we read a parable and it's talking about a king, the king is God, right? But here the king is not God, right? A king is exiting a city and a governor is coming in. So first, we escort the king out of the city to take leave in a dignified fashion, and afterwards they go out to greet the governor. Okay, first of all, why do we do that? Why do we first escort the king out and only then escort the governor in? Who's more important, a king or a governor?
King.
King, right? Right. So who's the king and who's the governor in this parable?
The Sabbath is the king?
Correct. Right. Usually they would think of the Sabbath as the queen, but here the Sabbath is a king and the governor is Yontif. Right? Governor's Yontif because Shabbos is more important than Yontif. Right? So we escort the king out, and that's Havdalah. And then we say Kiddush to welcome the festival. That's the governor. Okay. But that's not how we do it. Okay. So the Gemara asks, what is the halachic conclusion? What is the proper order of the blessing? Abaye said the proper order is Yud Kuv Zayin Hey Nun, Yud Kuv Zayin Nun Hey. Rava said the order is Yud Kuf Nun Hey Zayin, and the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. Okay, now this may not seem much to you, but to me, this is actually a big deal because the Gemara very often doesn't rule at all. It just gives you the range of opinions without reaching a ruling. And very often when it does reach a ruling, the ruling is not the same as our contemporary practice, right? But here, the Gemara is giving a ruling. It says Yaknahaz, and that's actually what we do even today. So it's a big deal for somebody like me. Okay. And so with regard to this issue of Havdalah, Gemara relates that Rav Huna bar Yehuda happened to the house of Rava. After Shabbat, they brought before them a light and spices. Rava recited the blessing over the spices first, and then the blessing over the light, which is what we do. Rav Huna bar Yehuda said to him, but both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, who dispute the order of the blessings at Havdalah, agree that the blessing over light is first, and only then comes the blessing over the spices. And what is this? As we learned in the Mishnah, Beit Shammai say with regard to one who is required to say grace after meals in Havdalah, and he has only 1 cup of wine, the proper order of the blessing is candle, grace after meals, spices, and Havdalah. And Beit Hillel says candle, spices, grace after meals, and the last is Havdalah. But both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree that the blessing over the candle is recited before the blessing over the spices. Rava answered after him and said, this Mishnah is the statement of Rabbi Meir. However, Rabbi Yehuda says Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel did not disagree over grace after meals, as everyone concurs that it is recited first, nor did they disagree over the blessing over the spices as it is recited last. Okay, so now we're getting back into disputing the authenticity of the tradition. I have to confess, I didn't think we would get this far this fast, so this is beyond where I prepared. So I'm gonna cut the class a little bit short tonight, but if there are any questions or comments, feel free.
Well, just wanted to drop in a remark that I had been working on the original Haggadah of the Kaifeng Jews. And I recall that the Havdalah is, or the Kiddush Havdalah sequence is said in a wildly different order than we were familiar with. One could ascribe it to a scribal error, but apparently the order Nahik, Ner, Havdalah, Yain, Kiddush was already attested as we had just reviewed.
Right. Now, the question, I mean, and I don't know, I mean, did you compare it with what they do in Persia? Right, because didn't the Kaifeng Jews originate in Persia?
Right,
I mean,
but I think I did. I don't think there was a Haggadah. There might have been. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. All right. Yeah, Leslie.
I have a question that has nothing to do with what you just taught us.
Okay.
But when we're saying, like, before we say the Shema, if there's not a minyan, you say God is a faithful king.
Right.
But why did they pick that phrase? Why does that have anything to do with not having a minyan and being able to say the Shema?
Okay, so there are a couple of theories. One has to do with keeping the number of words the same, because if there's a minyan, then at the leader says Adonai Elohechem Emet.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no minyan, the leader doesn't say that. So that's 3 words less. So El Melech Ne'aman, 3 words added. There's some mystical reason that I don't remember why you want the number of words to be the same. And the other is that there is a dispute over whether you say Amen to the blessing before the Shema or not. Okay, because there is a position that there should not be a pause, a half-second interruption between O Hevam O Yisrael and the Shema. Right now, when you say El Melech Ne'aman, and most people don't realize it, what is the acronym? Because we're big on acronyms in Hebrew. We not so much abbreviation, but acronyms, right? Like all this Yaknahas and whatever, right? El Melech Ne'aman, the acronym of El Melech Ne'aman is Amen.
Hmm.
So it resolves it by you're not saying amen, but you are saying amen,
Oh, okay.
because that's the acronym,
Got
right?
it.
I mean, you know, but one of the things that we see and we will see, you know, going forward is that there is a divergence of practices, right? There's not just one right way to do things, right? There are different traditions and different rationales and different reasons. And it is amazing, frankly, I have to say, it is amazing to me that the community which most strongly insists that there is only one proper way to do things is the community which excels in Talmud study more than any other, right? And I don't get how you can study Talmud all the time and still think that in Judaism there's only one way to do things. I mean, it's so clear from studying Talmud that there isn't only one way to do things. And I mean, you could say, well, yeah, you know, there's all these different ways, but, you know, if there's 10 different ways to do things, 9 of them are wrong. But that's not, you know, I mean, the Gemara isn't saying that, you know, well, Rabbi Yosef, I mean, sometimes they do. Rabbi Yehuda says this and he's wrong. But that's not usually the way, usually they just, Rabbi Yehuda says this. So anyway. Okay. Good night. Shabbat Shalom. See you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you.
Thanks.